The castle still slept, its stone walls black against the paling sky, yet life within had already begun. Before the first rooster crowed, the servants stirred. Bare feet padded across cold floors, hands fumbled for kindling, and sparks leapt into flames that would warm the day ahead. While lords and ladies dreamed in feather beds, the true heartbeat of the medieval household had already quickened. The invisible hands that kept the world turning. In every corner of the Middle Ages, from the mud-plastered cottages of peasants to the grand halls of dukes and kings, servants labored. They were the first to rise, and the last to sleep. Their names rarely appeared in chronicles. Their faces went unpainted in the tapestries of glory. Yet they were the ones who carried water, scrubbed rushes, mended boots, and prepared meals. Without them, the noble grandeur of medieval life would have collapsed into chaos. Imagine the morning scene inside a manor house. A boy, barely 12, stumbles into the kitchen, struggling with a bucket of well water so heavy it sloshes down his tunic. A girl, her hair hastily bound, kneels to sweep ash from the hearth, her fingers already blackened. In the corridors, another servant lays fresh rushes on the floor, masking the stench of yesterday's refuse. Each movement is small, but together they form the pulse of the household. By the time the master rises, the fires will burn, the bread will bake, the hall will shine, and he will believe it all appeared by magic. But the magic was human sweat. Servants were everywhere, yet nowhere. They were trusted but overlooked, essential yet undervalued. Their ears caught secrets in whispered corridors. Their hands brushed treasures they could never own, and their backs bent under burdens that fed the comfort of others. Theirs was a life of duty, discipline, and invisibility, stitched tightly into the daily fabric of medieval existence. What makes their story compelling is not only the labor they endured, but the paradox they embodied. They were both inside and outside society, sharing in the intimacy of their masters' lives, yet forever excluded from privilege. They dressed nobles, cleaned their wounds, even witnessed their most private moments, and yet they themselves remained shadows. To understand the medieval servant is to look past the glittering armor and silken gowns, and to see the foundation on which that glitter rested. Their world was not one of glory or romance, but of ceaseless toil and fragile hope. A boy might serve loyally for years, dreaming of becoming a squire, perhaps even a knight, but more often he remained a nameless helper, dismissed without thought. A girl might rise in trust as a lady's maid, handling jewels and silks, only to be cast out at the first hint of scandal. Theirs was a life balanced between opportunity and ruin, between visibility and oblivion. And yet there was dignity in their labor. To light a fire that warmed a hall, to prepare a feast that dazzled guests, to care for a child who would one day inherit the estate, these were acts of quiet significance. History rarely honors the invisible, but it is shaped by them. Without servants, the castles would have grown cold, the manors filthy, the feasts impossible. This is the story of those unseen figures, the men, women, and children whose sweat and sacrifice underpinned medieval life. Their tale is not told in chronicles of kings, but in the hush of dawn, in the scrape of broom against stone, in the crackle of fire before the household wakes. They were the invisible hands of the Middle Ages, and without them, history itself would have faltered. The word servant in the Middle Ages could mean many things. To the nobleman, it might mean the steward who managed his estate, a trusted figure who handled accounts and oversaw daily life. To the peasant, it might mean the plowboy hired for a season's work, sleeping in a barn and paid in bread and ale. To the church, servants included lay brothers who labored in silence, cooking and cleaning for monks who spent their days in prayer. The roles were diverse, but all shared one truth. Service meant living in the shadow of another's will. Some were freeborn, choosing service as employment. A young man might leave his father's fields to enter a great household, dreaming of better food, new clothing, or perhaps advancement. A woman might take service as a maid to learn the skills of running a household, hoping one day to marry respectably. In towns, apprentices served masters in exchange for training, their work as much obligation as opportunity. These free servants had some agency, though their lives were often harsh and their futures uncertain. Others were bound by feudal ties. Serfs, legally tied to the land, might also be summoned to serve in their lord's hall. They could be called upon to cut wood, tend animals, or haul supplies into the manor. Unlike hired servants, they could not leave at will. Their service was part of their bondage, inherited as much as the soil they plowed. A serf's daughter could find herself working in her lord's kitchen not because she sought it, but because duty demanded it. Then there were retainers, a class of servants who blurred the line between labor and loyalty. Retainers included squires who served knights, grooms who cared for horses, and men-at-arms who stood ready for war. They were servants, yes, but also part of a household's prestige. To have many retainers showed wealth and power. A lord's reputation was measured not only in lands, but in how many men wore his livery. These retainers lived better than peasants, but their fates were bound tightly to their masters' fortunes. Children, too, were drawn into service. Many families sent their sons and daughters into other households from as young as 7. For some, it was a way of lessening the burden at home while securing food and training for their children. Boys learned trades as apprentices, while girls served as maids, scullions, or wet nurses. Childhood was brief in the Middle Ages, and service often marked its end. A child might leave his parents' cottage at an age when modern children still play with toys, stepping instead into a life of ceaseless work. Not all servants came willingly. Prisoners of war could be forced into servitude, their labor enriching the victors. In some regions, slaves still existed, remnants of older systems where captives were sold or inherited. Though less common in later centuries, this shadow of enforced service haunted the early Middle Ages, a reminder that not all labor was chosen, and freedom was a fragile thing. Service, then, was not a single condition but a spectrum, from the steward who dined at his master's table to the scullery boy scraping pots in the dark. What united them was dependence, a life shaped not by their own desires, but by the needs of others. Whether through choice, duty, or compulsion, servants lived within the framework of hierarchy, where every task they performed reinforced the order of medieval society. And yet this diversity of roles made them indispensable. Without the free servant, no noble could run his household. Without the serf, no manor could thrive. Without the retainer, no lord could boast of strength. Servants were not one class, but many, woven together into the very fabric of the Middle Ages. To understand them is to glimpse the machinery behind the glittering surface of medieval life. A machinery built on hands that carried water, bent over fields, polished armor, and whispered obedience in the dark. The manor house, with its timber beams and smoke-darkened halls, may have looked majestic to the peasant's eye. But to the servant it was a place of unending duty. From dawn to nightfall, every corner demanded hands to sweep, fires to stoke, and mouths to feed. The grandeur of the Lord's household was built not on stone alone, but on the backs of men and women who toiled invisibly within its walls. The first labor was fire. Before the noble stirred from his bed, servants were already crouched in chill corridors, coaxing flames to life. Ashes from the night before were scraped away, embers fed with kindling, until each hearth glowed anew. It was more than comfort. It was survival. In winter, without these fires, even the thickest walls could not keep out the bitter cold. A servant who failed in this duty risked not only his master's anger, but the health of the entire household. In the kitchens, the day began in chaos. Water had to be fetched from wells or nearby streams, hauled in sloshing buckets that soaked the servants' tunics. Bread, the staple of every meal, had to be baked, an hours-long task that required kneading, tending ovens, and watching flames with hawk-like care. Pots of porridge or stews simmered slowly, flavored with whatever the manor's stores allowed. Beans, peas, salted meat, or if fortune smiled, fresh game from the Lord's hunts. Cooks commanded small armies of kitchen boys and scullions, each scrubbing, chopping, or turning spits until the hall filled with the smell of roasting. Laundry was another endless task. Clothing was not washed as often as today, but when it was, it meant days of labor. Women hauled heavy garments to streams, beating them against stones or scrubbing them with lye soap, their hands raw from cold water and harsh chemicals. Then came drying, folding, and sometimes mending torn seams with clumsy needles in dim light. Noble finery, embroidered gowns, velvet tunics, delicate linens, required even greater care, for a single tear could cost a servant dearly. The manor's animals, too, demanded constant attention. Servants rose early to feed pigs, cattle, and chickens, clean stalls, and carry hay. Horses were brushed and watered, for they were the pride of any noble household, their condition reflecting the Lord's wealth. A stable boy who failed in his duties might find himself whipped, or worse, dismissed with disgrace. Inside the manor, women servants tended to the children, wiping noses, soothing cries, and teaching them the basics of prayer and manners. The children of the Lord might be dressed in silks or woolens, but it was the servant who tightened their belts, combed their hair, and bore the brunt of tantrums. Wet nurses nursed infants not their own, sacrificing their strength to nourish the noble line. These women were both essential and invisible, standing in the shadows of the lineage they helped sustain. And always there was cleaning. Floors strewn with rushes had to be swept and replaced, for they became filthy with food scraps, grease, and vermin. Tapestries collected smoke and dust. Chamber pots required emptying, an odious task that fell to the lowest in the household hierarchy. Servants also polished the Lord's silverware and washed wooden trenchers until they gleamed, preparing them for the next feast that would be praised but never credited to their labor. The day ended as it began, with fire. Servants doused embers or banked them carefully to last until morning. Doors were barred, animals secured, and the hall made ready for sleep. Only then, when the household fell quiet, could servants collapse into their own hard beds, or more often, the cold floor near the kitchens or stables. Sleep was brief, for dawn would soon return, and with it, another cycle of unending duties. In the glittering picture of medieval life, the Lord's feasts and the ladies' silks draw the eye. Yet behind them stood the unseen reality, 100 small labors performed by hands that never rested. The manor was a world unto itself, and its servants the gears that kept it alive. Without them the fires would die, the larders grow empty, and the halls turn silent. They were the heartbeat of the manor, tireless and unthanked. If the manor house was the steady heartbeat of medieval life, the castle was its thunder. Towers rose against the sky, banners snapped in the wind, and stone walls promised security. But behind those walls, a hidden army of servants labored to keep the castle alive. Their work carried them through the rhythms of both peace and war, making them as essential as any knight in shining armor. The castle's daily life required dozens, sometimes hundreds, of hands. In the great hall, cooks labored in kitchens larger than many peasant cottages, roasting whole oxen, baking vast loaves, and brewing ale in copper kettles. Servants darted in and out, carrying platters through smoky corridors, their shoulders aching under the weight. Beyond the kitchens, laundresses bent over steaming tubs, scrubbing clothes until their backs screamed, while stable hands brushed horses until their coats gleamed like polished bronze. The page and the squire held special places within this world. Pages, often boys from noble or wealthy families, served lords directly, fetching water, carrying messages, and attending at table. Their service was both labor and training, a path that might one day lead to knighthood. Squires, older and stronger, tended armor and weapons, polishing breastplates until they shone and sharpening swords until they could split a hair. In peace, these duties were menial. In war, they became matters of life and death. A squire's careful work could mean the difference between a knight's survival and his ruin on the battlefield. Then there were the grooms, who tended to horses with a devotion bordering on reverence. In castles where cavalry was the spine of military power, horses were as precious as gold. Grooms cleaned stalls, hauled hay, and kept saddles oiled. They slept near the animals they served, ready at a moment's call. During sieges, these same men might risk their lives leading mounts to safety, or slipping through enemy lines with messages. Other servants lived on the edges of both practicality and prestige. Falconers, for example, trained and cared for hunting birds that symbolized nobility itself. Their art required skill and patience, and though they were still servants, falconers often enjoyed unusual trust and status. Messengers, too, lived dangerously, riding through forests and across hostile lands to carry a lord's words. Their loyalty was measured in speed and silence. The castle itself, massive as it seemed, demanded endless upkeep. Servants patched walls, carried stones, and hauled water up winding staircases. They cleaned latrines that emptied into moats, a task as disgusting as it was vital. They prepared guest chambers for visiting lords, setting rushes, bedding, and candles with care. A castle could be a fortress, a court, and a home all at once, and it was servants who ensured it never collapsed under its own weight. When war came, their roles changed overnight. Kitchen fires cooked not feasts, but rations of salted meat and beans for soldiers. Laundresses became nurses, boiling linens to bind wounds. Stable boys fetched water for defenders, or carried stones to hurl from the battlements. Even scullions were pressed into service, rushing buckets of boiling oil or sand to the walls. Servants did not fight with sword or lance, but their labor sustained those who did. Without them, the walls would starve, the fires die, and the defenders weaken. And yet, in times of peace, castles were also stages of grandeur, and servants the unseen actors behind the spectacle. They lit torches for tournaments, polished armor for parades, prepared vast banquets where nobles toasted and minstrels sang. A servant's labor might never earn applause, but it made possible the pageantry that defined noble life. Thus, in war and peace alike, servants were the hidden backbone of the castle. They lived in its shadows, yet their work echoed through every chamber, from kitchens to battlements. Without their hands, no knight could shine, no feast could dazzle, no castle could stand. They were the invisible soldiers of stone and fire, fighting battles of endurance long after banners ceased to wave. If lords and ladies lived in light, servants dwelt in shadow. Their lives were measured not only by endless labor, but by the meager comforts, or lack thereof, that accompanied it. To understand the daily existence of medieval servants, one must step away from the grandeur of feasts and chambers and into the corners where straw beds lay. Scraps of food were shared, and exhaustion pressed heavier than stone. The sleeping quarters of servants were often little more than cramped, darkened spaces. In manor houses, they might sleep in the kitchens, their rest stolen among the smell of ashes and stale bread. Others bedded down in lofts above stables, lulled to sleep by the restless shifting of horses. In castles, where space was precious, servants crowded into small chambers, or even along hall floors, lying shoulder to shoulder on rushes. Privacy was non-existent, and warmth scarce. In winter, the cold bit through stone and straw alike, leaving servants to huddle together for survival. Food was another marker of their lowly place. The Lord's table groaned under roasted meats, pies, and imported spices, but servants lived on simpler fare: dark bread, pottage made from peas or beans, and, when fortune allowed, scraps of meat or fish left from the feast. At times, servants were permitted to eat leftovers from their master's table, though often they were served separately, their bowls filled with what nobles had not touched. Hunger was a familiar companion. In lean years, servants might eat less than the peasants who worked the fields, for noble households always fed their lords first. Clothing, too, reflected hardship. While nobles wore silks and velvets, servants were given rough woolens or patched hand-me-downs. Many had but one or two sets of garments, worn until they frayed into rags. Shoes were scarce for the poorest, leaving them barefoot even in winter. Those serving directly in the halls or chambers of nobility might be given liveries, simple tunics in their master's colors, which offered not luxury, but the visible badge of servitude. The hours of work pressed heavily on body and spirit. Servants rose long before dawn and rarely rested before midnight. Their backs bent under buckets of water, their fingers blistered from endless scrubbing, their lungs filled with the smoke of fires they tended. Illness was common, yet rest was rare. A sick servant risked dismissal, for the household could not afford idleness. Death in youth was no surprise. Many servants never saw old age. Despite this hardship, bonds of fellowship often grew among them. Servants shared stories by the fire, whispered jokes in corridors, and offered comfort in stolen moments. Together they endured the drudgery, forging small communities within the larger household. For many, these friendships were lifelines in a world where their worth was measured only in labor. Yet servants also lived under constant scrutiny and danger. A spilled goblet at a feast, a missing loaf of bread, a harsh word overheard. Any of these could bring punishment. Whippings, beatings, or dismissal were common, and in some cases, servants accused of theft faced the stocks or even the gallows. Fear shadowed every task, for their lives depended not only on their skill, but on their master's mood. And still, within the shadows, there were glimpses of humanity. A boy whistling softly as he polished armor, a girl laughing as she scrubbed rushes, her voice carrying through the stone halls, a weary servant stealing a moment to gaze at the stars after the fires were banked. Their lives were hard, but they were not without small sparks of joy. These sparks, though fleeting, remind us that even in the darkest corners of medieval society, the human spirit endured. Thus, while the lords dined and the ladies danced, the servants lived in hardship, cold, hungry, and weary. They were invisible not because they were absent, but because they were always there, hidden in the shadows of the great halls they kept alive. Their existence was one of endurance, a quiet struggle for survival beneath the glitter of the Middle Ages. In the rigid hierarchy of the Middle Ages, loyalty was both a servant's shield and a chain. A master valued obedience above all else, and a servant's fate often hinged on the delicate balance between trust and fear. To serve faithfully was to survive, perhaps even rise. To falter was to risk humiliation, violence, or ruin. Theirs was a world where devotion could bring favor, but mistakes could end lives. Trust, when earned, was powerful. A lord might place the keys to his storerooms in the hands of a steward, entrust a nurse with the care of his infant heir, or rely on a groom to guard his prized warhorse. These servants carried immense responsibility, their loyalty measured not only in work, but in silence. To overhear a secret was dangerous. To keep it faithfully was invaluable. Some servants rose to surprising heights, managing estates, handling accounts, even advising their lords. Their power was borrowed, fragile, and always revocable. But for a few, loyalty became a path to influence. Yet beneath this potential lay constant threat. A servant lived under the gaze of masters quick to anger and slow to forgive. A spilled goblet at a feast might provoke public humiliation. A cuff across the face, a torrent of scorn, or worse, a beating before the entire hall. Thieves among servants were punished harshly, fingers cut off, bodies whipped, or culprits locked in stocks for the village to jeer at. Fear was not merely a possibility. It was the silent overseer of every task. Punishment was not only physical, but social. A servant dismissed in disgrace could lose not only his employment, but his reputation. Word spread quickly in medieval communities, and a dismissed servant found few willing to hire him again. For women, the stakes were even higher. A maid accused of impropriety or theft risked not only dismissal, but ruin, branded with shame that might follow her for life. Fear, therefore, was woven into every act, every word, every glance. And yet, the bond between master and servant was often intimate. Servants dressed their lords, bandaged their wounds, carried their children, and even prepared their bodies for burial. This closeness created strange ties, part trust, part dependency, part dominance. A loyal servant might be rewarded with gifts of clothing, coins, or even land. Loyalty was currency, one that could elevate a servant above his peers, securing better food, warmer quarters, and protection from harsher punishments. At the same time, loyalty could be demanded unto death. A squire might follow his knight into battle, risking his life without question. A maid might be sworn to secrecy over a scandal that, if revealed, could destroy her mistress. Some servants died not from accident or neglect, but from unwavering fidelity to their master's commands. Their devotion was praised as noble, yet it was also the proof of their subjugation, lives valued only insofar as they served. There were also moments of rebellion. Chronicles whisper of servants who stole jewels and fled, of cooks who poisoned stew pots, of stable boys who betrayed their lords to enemies. For most, such defiance ended at the gallows, their bodies swinging as warnings. But the very fact that rebellion occurred speaks to the weight of servitude, to the crushing burdens that could twist loyalty into defiance. In truth, a servant's life was a constant negotiation between fear and favor. To survive was to serve well, silently, invisibly. To thrive was to win trust without overstepping, to show loyalty without demanding recognition. Theirs was a tightrope walked daily, with reward on one side and punishment on the other. Thus, the life of a medieval servant was not simply toil, but tension, an existence defined by devotion, shadowed by dread. Loyalty might raise them from obscurity. Fear might cast them back into misery. It was a game they could never stop playing, for in the world of master and servant, loyalty was life, and fear was always waiting in the shadows. The calendar of the Middle Ages was marked by feast days, holy celebrations, and festivals that broke the grind of toil with flashes of splendor. To the noble guest, these occasions were dazzling. Tables groaning under roasted meats, halls glittering with candlelight, music echoing against high rafters. Yet behind the pageantry stood servants whose sweat and skill conjured the spectacle. For them, festivals meant not rest, but redoubled labor, and feasts were battles of endurance fought with trays and tankards instead of swords. Preparations began days, sometimes weeks, in advance. Servants scrubbed great halls from floor to ceiling, laying fresh rushes to mask stench and scattering herbs to sweeten the air. Kitchens became war zones of noise and heat, with cooks shouting orders above the roar of fires. Scullions plucked geese until feathers carpeted the floor, boys hauled water until their backs ached, and women kneaded bread until their hands cramped. A single banquet could consume entire larders, and it was servants who transformed stores into spectacle. On the day of the feast, their work intensified. Great spits turned ceaselessly, manned by sweating boys whose task was to roast whole boars or deer until golden. Bakers rushed to and fro, carrying pies stuffed with spiced meats, while brewers rolled barrels of ale into place. Wine, too, flowed freely, poured by nervous attendants who knew a lord's temper might flare if a goblet ran dry. Every dish, every cup, was not only food, but theater, meant to proclaim wealth and power through abundance. The servants' role did not end in the kitchens. In the hall itself, they became part of the performance. Pages darted between tables, offering trenchers and refilling cups. Musicians, often servants or hired minstrels, played lutes and flutes, their songs weaving through the clamor of voices. Jesters cracked jokes and tumbled, while jugglers and dancers entertained. Even the lowliest scullion might be pressed into carrying torches, standing rigid as wax dripped onto his arms, for light itself was part of the illusion. Yet the feast was not without danger for those who served it. A spilled platter, a cold dish, or an empty goblet could bring humiliation or punishment. Servants knew to keep their heads bowed, their voices soft, their movements precise. Still, within the frenzy, small rebellions blossomed. A servant might steal a bite of spiced meat when backs were turned, or slip a cup of wine to a friend. For many, the feast was the only time they tasted luxuries otherwise reserved for nobles. Festivals also revealed the paradox of servitude. While nobles feasted, servants starved for rest, their bodies aching under the weight of ceaseless demands. Yet festivals could also bring moments of joy. Music lifted spirits, laughter spread even to the kitchens, and the shared struggle of preparation bound servants together. For a few precious hours, amid the chaos, they glimpsed the magic they had created, not as guests, but as witnesses. And sometimes, the line between servant and spectacle blurred. Chroniclers tell of witty servants who entertained lords with sharp tongues, earning applause and even coin. Others sang songs or told tales when musicians faltered, their humor briefly elevating them above their station. For a moment, a servant could steal the spotlight, reminding all that even in the rigid hierarchy of the Middle Ages, wit and courage could pierce the veil of invisibility. When the feast ended, nobles retired sated, but servants faced their hardest work yet. Clearing bones, scrubbing goblets, dousing fires, and carrying waste to the refuse heaps. While their masters slept in comfort, servants toiled deep into the night, the glamour of the feast fading back into drudgery. By dawn, only tired faces and aching limbs remained, the hall once more theirs to clean, as if no celebration had ever passed. Thus, medieval festivals were paradoxes of joy and burden. For lords, they were spectacles of wealth. For servants, they were trials of endurance. Yet without servants, no feast could dazzle, no festival shine. They were the unseen architects of splendor, the hands that wove magic from sweat, the silent chorus behind the song of celebration. If men filled halls with labor and fields with toil, women in service moved quietly in the shadows of chambers, nurseries, and kitchens. Their work was indispensable, their presence constant, and yet their lives balanced on a knife's edge, between trust and danger, dignity and exploitation. To be a woman in service during the Middle Ages was to live with both closeness to power and exposure to peril. Many women entered service as maids, laundresses, or kitchen helpers. Their days began with the rising of the household, scrubbing floors, carrying water, or pounding grain for bread. In kitchens, they chopped vegetables, stirred great pots of pottage, and washed trenchers slick with grease. Laundry was their constant enemy, for noble garments were heavy and delicate, demanding endless hours of scrubbing in icy streams or steaming tubs. Their bodies bore the marks of labor: cracked hands, bent backs, and weary feet. Some rose higher in trust, becoming ladies' maids or seamstresses. These women handled silks and jewels, combed hair, laced gowns, and whispered in noble women's ears. In these roles, they were confidants as much as servants, privy to secrets of love, scandal, and sorrow. A lady might confide her fears of childbirth, her longing for freedom, or her bitterness toward her lord. The maid who listened carried both privilege and burden, for secrets could bind or destroy. Wet nurses held perhaps the most intimate role. They nourished the infants of noble families with their own milk, often leaving their own children to be cared for by others. This bond made them both trusted and vulnerable. To fail in care was unthinkable. To succeed meant carrying the lifeblood of a dynasty in their arms. Yet when the child grew, the nurse was often dismissed, her closeness forgotten, her sacrifice unrecorded. But alongside trust came danger. Women in service were exposed to the whims of men who saw them as vulnerable prey. Chronicles whisper of maids coerced by lords, of laundresses harassed by soldiers, of wet nurses entangled in scandal. A nobleman's misdeed could ruin a maid's life, for the blame often fell not on the master, but the servant. A girl might be cast out, her reputation destroyed, her future narrowed to hardship or shame. Even within the household, competition and envy gnawed at women in service. A favored maid might be despised by her peers, accused of pride or worse. A laundress caught with stolen cloth could face whipping, even if the theft was minor. Women lived not only under their master's scrutiny, but also under the eyes of one another, their fortunes rising and falling with whispers in the corridors. Yet women in service were not only victims of circumstance, they carved space for resilience and cunning. A clever maid might secure gifts from her mistress, or win the favor of a steward, or barter scraps of food for small comforts. Some women used their wit to climb further, becoming mistresses of lords, or securing advantageous marriages. Though these paths were fraught with danger, they revealed the agency women found within the tight confines of servitude. Festivals and holy days offered fleeting relief. Women servants might sing with one another in the kitchens, dance briefly after the hall was cleared, or sneak stolen bites of feast day food. For a moment, laughter rang louder than duty. These small joys stitched together lives otherwise worn thin by labor and worry. Their stories rarely reached parchment, yet their presence filled the world of the Middle Ages. They raised children not their own, carried burdens no noblewoman could bear, and endured hardships that history has too often forgotten. Women in service were the quiet backbone of noble households, trusted hands, silent witnesses, and too often, forgotten lives. Though their real lives were filled with drudgery and shadows, servants walked brightly through the pages of medieval literature. In tales told at feasts, in songs sung by minstrels, and in manuscripts copied by monks, servants appeared as tricksters, fools, loyal companions, and sometimes even heroes. The way they were imagined revealed not only how society viewed them, but also the hopes, fears, and humor that surrounded their place in the medieval world. In courtly romances, servants were often invisible but essential. The knight might dazzle with his courage, and the lady with her beauty, but behind them were squires polishing armor, pages carrying messages, and maids preparing gowns. Their presence lingered in the background, acknowledged only when their loyalty proved critical. A squire might save his master by bringing a sword at the right moment, or a maid might reveal a secret that turned the course of a tale. They were rarely central, but without them, the story could not unfold. Comedy, however, loved the servant. Medieval plays, performed in marketplaces and churchyards, often featured bumbling maids or sharp-tongued grooms. They mocked their masters with clever jests, exposed hypocrisy, and won laughter by turning hierarchy upside down. In farces, a servant might outwit his lord, steal a kiss from a lady, or twist a priest's sermon into nonsense. The audience roared, for in laughter they tasted a world turned on its head, where those who labored in shadows had their moment in the sun. The fabliaux, those ribald French tales filled with mischief and scandal, often cast servants as cunning accomplices or mischievous lovers. A maid might smuggle a suitor into her mistress's chamber, or a stable boy might trick a gullible priest. These tales delighted in showing servants breaking free from obedience, indulging in cleverness and desire. To the common folk, they were cathartic, a fantasy of rebellion wrapped in humor. Even serious literature gave servants symbolic weight. In allegories, they represented humility, obedience, or the baser needs of humanity. A servant's labor could be cast as a metaphor for the soul's struggle, or his silence as a symbol of submission to God. Writers used their roles to teach moral lessons, shaping the servant into more than flesh and bone, into an emblem of society's values. Yet some legends offered glimpses of admiration. Loyal retainers who followed masters unto death were celebrated in chronicles and chansons. A squire who refused to abandon his knight on the battlefield might be praised for courage as much as the knight himself. In stories of saints, humble servants sometimes became martyrs, their obedience transformed into holiness. These rare tales gave dignity to roles otherwise considered lowly. But literature also revealed the unease society felt about servants. They were close to their masters, privy to secrets, and therefore both trusted and feared. Tales warned of maids who betrayed mistresses, squires who turned against lords, or servants who used cunning to rise above their station. Fiction exaggerated these fears, but it mirrored reality. The master relied on the servant, yet never fully trusted him. What is striking is how often servants in legend had voices sharper than those history allowed them. On the page or stage, they spoke truths, mocked authority, and even triumphed through wit. In reality, such acts might have earned them punishment or ruin. In fiction, however, society permitted the fantasy of reversal, enjoying the thought of servants who saw through the illusions of power. Thus, in the medieval imagination, servants were both shadow and spark. They reflected the anxieties of dependence, the humor of daily life, and the possibility of subversion. While chronicles overlooked their real struggles, literature gave them a strange kind of immortality, not as themselves, but as characters shaped by the dreams and fears of their age. In story, the servant was more than invisible labor. He was laughter, danger, loyalty, and cunning all at once. When the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the world shifted. Art flourished, trade expanded, and new ideas swept through Europe. Yet for the servant, much remained the same. Though the castles grew more refined and the cities more vibrant, the invisible labor of men and women in service continued to underpin society. The story of medieval servants did not end with the closing of their age. It echoed forward, shaping the centuries that followed. In noble houses, the roles of steward, maid, cook, and groom carried on almost unchanged. The Renaissance court demanded even greater pageantry, and with it, more hands to prepare feasts, polish floors, and tend wardrobes of increasing splendor. Servants no longer worked only in smoky manors, but also in palaces adorned with marble and gold. The settings were grander, the expectations higher, but the pattern endured. The visible glory of the few rested upon the invisible toil of the many. In towns and cities, domestic service became one of the most common occupations, especially for women. Young girls from the countryside flooded into urban households, seeking employment as maids or laundresses. For some, this was a step toward marriage or independence. For many, it was a lifetime of labor. Their youth spent scrubbing floors, fetching water, and nursing children not their own. The cycle of hope and hardship that defined medieval service simply adapted to a new age. The inheritance of fear and control also lingered. Servants remained bound by strict codes of obedience. They could still be dismissed for the smallest error, punished for theft or insolence, and judged harshly for any hint of scandal. Manuals of household management from the 16th and 17th centuries described in detail how masters should discipline their staff, echoing the same anxieties about loyalty and betrayal that haunted medieval lords. Trust remained rare, suspicion constant. Yet alongside hardship, the tradition of loyalty endured. Some servants became confidants and companions, remembered in memoirs and honored in wills. Others carved spaces of quiet power, managing estates, advising mistresses, or handling correspondence. Just as in the Middle Ages, a faithful servant might rise above obscurity, their devotion rewarded with modest wealth or influence. For every forgotten scullion, there were also those whose names lingered in history because they stood close to power. The cultural image of servants also evolved, shaped by their medieval roots. In Elizabethan drama, the witty servant became a staple character. Echoes of medieval jesters and clever maids who spoke truths their masters dared not hear. In novels centuries later, the faithful butler or mischievous maid became archetypes recognizable across Europe. Literature remembered what history often forgot, that servants, though bound by duty, shaped stories through loyalty, wit, and quiet defiance. Most of all, the legacy of medieval servitude lives in the structure of domestic service that persisted well into modern times. The great houses of the 18th and 19th centuries, with armies of butlers, footmen, and housemaids, were direct descendants of the medieval household. The same rhythms, early rising, ceaseless labor, invisibility in splendor, echoed across centuries. When we think of servants in Victorian novels or even in modern dramas, we are seeing the long shadow of medieval life stretching forward. Today, their world feels distant, yet it lingers in subtle ways. The division between those who serve and those who are served has not vanished. It has merely changed shape. The medieval servant, anonymous yet essential, reminds us that history is not built by kings alone, but by countless hands that carried water, scrubbed floors, and bore burdens. Their legacy is humility, endurance, and the unrecorded labor that sustains every age. So when we picture the Middle Ages, we must not only see knights and queens, battles and feasts, we must also see the servant, a boy hauling water before dawn, a girl scrubbing rushes until her hands bleed, a woman cradling an infant not her own. They were the unseen pillars of their world, and their echoes remain with us still.